The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events, the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video aired has a special discount code for today only in the comments section with a link to the video offered. And to see everything we do, or if you want to receive notice of new releases, new products, and new events for artists, simply click the other link, which says, see everything we do. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes with Plein Air and Fine Art Connoisseur magazines, and I hope you're enjoying these video segments to keep you occupied and interested in learning to paint. Today we've got one called Simplifying for Success, Landscapes in Oil with Chuck Marshall. Hope you enjoy it.
Hi, I'm Chuck Marshall. I'm an oil painter from Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm here today to teach you how to simplify starting the landscape. When I was a kid, I was doing art just like a lot of people. I was doodling and playing around and stuff. So fresh out of high school, I went into the military, and when I got out, I wanted to find an art school to start my career, and I found the Cincinnati Art Academy. One year there, I ended up getting married and moving to California, and then I found the California Art Institute in Calabasas, California, which was a few miles down the road from where I lived, but it ended up moving 2 blocks from where I lived, so I was able to walk there every day. And that is a big reason and part of what has gotten me here today. In today's video, we'll be discussing the start of a painting and just how important it is to the end result. The first thing we're going to discuss are my painting supplies. Let's get started. So now I want to talk about my art supplies that I use, which I call my tools. First of all, I want to start with brushes. So I'll start with the biggest one first. I use this in the studio to apply paint, but I also use it to put a wash on a canvas, and today I'll be using it just for that purpose. I have a variety of brushes, and they all have different purposes. I will pull a few of them up here just so you have an idea what I'm talking about. For these, all these have different purposes. I use this more as calligraphy. I use this for applying paint. I use this for applying paint, but they apply differently. This is more of a chunking, and this is more of a softer application, which I tend to use more towards the finish of a painting. I don't use too many small brushes, but I do use occasional small brush like this one, and I use it for the purpose of applying limbs, smaller pieces of color, and some detail work. So that's pretty much it for the brushes I use. Next, let's get some paint out on the palette. Okay, I start out with applying paint on the palette in a typical manner of light to dark. I always put them in the same placement so I know exactly where it is, so that I know when I'm mixing that I can point to this color without even looking. So it has muscle memory to it. So I'm going to start out with my titanium white. Put enough out there for what I'm doing. I use a warm and cool in my primary colors, and So this lemon yellow would be my cool. The cad yellow would be my warmer color. And then I go to my reds, which I make a big jump on my reds, and I use cad red as my warm red. And what I found with reds is it's so easy to make them both warm and cool no matter which one I'm using. So some people consider alizarin to be cooler. I consider it to be warmer, but it's also darker, so I use it next. Darker in value. I have a color that I've been playing with lately, which is amethyst, and I like it and I use it occasionally, so I'm going to put it out today simply because I know when I use it with my greens a lot of times. It makes a nice glowing green. Then I go to my blues, and in this case I'm going to switch from my darker color starting out, which is ultramarine. And if I did nothing else, that would be my limited palette. But I have other colors I've been using lately, and so I'm adding cerulean. And at one time I did not have that on there. I would use Viridian and make what I would consider a cerulean. But so I'm going to add my Viridian. I use it for other reasons as well. I don't typically just use it as a green. I use it for mixing in other colors as well as using for green. Then I switch to what I call my earth tones. In this case, I have two earth tones, raw sienna and burnt sienna. My raw sienna is part of what I use as a tone for the canvas. It gives me a nice warm number 5 value, which I like. And my last color is burnt sienna. And burnt sienna gives me, it's also what I consider a red, but it gives me some nice warm grays and helps with some warming up some of my colors in the foreground. Now that I have my palette set out, let's learn how to keep it simple. The concept of keeping it simple in the beginning is so important. I want to explain that to you, hopefully in a way that makes sense. Keeping it simple to me is learning how to use big value shapes. When you're painting a painting such as a Sentinel, which I did on location, I had to separate out where all the big value shapes were for me to understand how to apply paint, my values, and my colors. So what that means is when I'm doing the big value shapes, I'm looking at this scene and I make my sky one big value shape. I give it a regional or an average color, and so on with the background, with the hillside. I did the same thing with the water, and then I did the same thing with the foreground. Now, obviously, you see a little drawing in there, but I wanted to show you what I was looking at when I did that. So, although that drawing's there, I tend to find an average value that represents the whole of that scene. Now, there's a red barn there with a teal shingled roof, and then there's a gray road. Those are not showing up here because those aren't as important to me as the values are. So when I give it that one value, I can go back in and put those colors in, but I want to stay within the value shape. So my ranges of values, let's just say a 6 to a 10 that's in here, will not be the same value ranges that are in these other shapes because these shapes have a different value range. And for me, that separates out things so that I can understand. And that's the trick to keeping it simple. Okay, when we're outside and we're confronted with this scene, one of the ways I handle that is I do a thumbnail. This is something that is almost everybody does outside, but I try to keep it so that it's an understanding to me. So it may not be as rendered out as most people would do it. But today I'm going to kind of render it out a little bit more, just so you understand. But I use markers, and I use value markers, and I have 4 values. And so I separate my shapes out, hopefully, to 4 values. I can always double up on a value if I need something darker or whatever. But at this point, I'm going to start a drawing, which is what I do outside. I'm going to do a little bit bigger here, but I will make the shape of my canvas, in this case, a horizontal. So I just get my horizontal shape in there. And by the way, I consider this the first step of composition, is knowing whether it's a horizontal or a vertical as far as my composition goes. And I've already decided my composition, and so I'm just going to render it out for you. But a lot of times I will use, and you can see, how dark it is right there. I'll use that as my lightest light, or I'll leave the paper white. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and put that in as a value. I'm going to akin or the same as toning a canvas. So this would be my first initial tone, or my first big shape. And there's a background hill in here, and then there's the lake in the middle, and then there's the foreground. So I'm going to do, going lightest to darkest, I'm going to do that background. So I know that it's about this far up. Well, shoot, I grabbed something a little too, there we go. I'm going to put this shape in as a value. And for me, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to be understood. So I'm going to go ahead, and because this and this is the same value, I want this middle ground lake to be just a smidge darker. So I'm going to go ahead and double up so it's a little bit darker. So now I have 3 values. And then I'm going to do my foreground, which is where most of my drawing is going to be. So I'm going to use my finer point to indicate the shapes. So I know that there is a barn that kind of sits right here with some trees. And then there's these bushes, and then there's this bigger shape here, which is an integral part of my composition. And that's about as more drawing than I normally would do. Normally I just throw it down as a value with markers. Now, within that, there's a road, there's rendering of the barn, so on and so forth. But it really isn't important to me because it doesn't talk about the values. It talks about drawing when I render all that out. So the drawing I can get more involved with later. Because once I have all my values down, I should have a composition that is understood. And that's the basic abstract composition of my painting right there. Now I can come in at any point and make adjustments to that, but this is normally what I would do outside, and it'd probably be a lot rougher sketch than this. But I have rendered it totally out in the past. But for me, this tells me, okay, lightest, darker, this is lighter but darker than that, and this is my darkest big shape. So just for the purpose of understanding why I did it this way, I can come in and I can put my barn, I can render that out now as an understanding of where all this fits together and how. For instance, there's a road that comes in about right there. You know, and there's trees, some bushes, and so on and so forth. So you kind of get the concept of where everything fits together. But I wouldn't normally go to this length of outlining or rendering all this out, simply because all I need to know is for this painting to be successful, I need simply to understand this value, this value, this value, and this value. And the rest is just breaking those values apart. Okay, so this is how I start my thumbnails, and this is how I get to understand my value shapes. So having this completed, let's put a canvas up and get to painting. Okay, now that we've done the marker comps and the thumbnail, you got to see how I simplify the shapes. We want to do it on canvas. And so for my start of the canvas, I usually use a raw sienna tone, and I lay it down as a wash. And it gives me a value that I can start with for one. It also gives me a way of not having the white of the canvas glaring through. So that would be my first step. So let's go ahead and get started. So when I'm thinking about toning the canvas, I'm not trying to use pure pigment. I'm trying to take my medium and thin it way down, just so I can get a wet surface to paint into. And that wet surface gives me my wet on wet technique that I use outside, a starting place, so that I'm not, again, not just using the blank canvas. And when you're outside, that white is so glaring, it's hard on the eyes. This knocks that down. You're able to see values better this way. At least it is that way for me. So once I get something on there, the next step is to simply, let me cover that just a little bit better. The next step is to simply wipe off some of that. I don't want to get rid of it. I just want to kind of knock down the brushwork so it's not distracting. And if I use too much mineral spirits, it gets rid of some of that. So my reference here, the title of the painting, The Sentinel, was done on location, and the painting was sold, so all I have is this photograph to use as reference. But I'm going to do the same process that I used when I was outside. And the process was to tone the canvas and then start building shapes, just like I did with the thumbnails. But in this case, it's going to be a little different because I now have a value on there, which you can call whatever you assign that value. It's probably not a number 5, but it's close. So I'm going to actually try to go from 1 value to 2 real quick. And by using my reference, I am going to pull out some of the paint so I've got my lightest value shape. Now, this is not necessarily an exact drawing. It's just a place to start. So I'm going to use this, get rid of some of the sky. And I may have to use a little bit of mineral spirits in order to do that, but I just need a place to start. So once I get that finished, I can come in and refine what I had tried to accomplish there. And that will not be the finished drawing, but it will indicate my lightest value shape. Now I've got 2 values. And because I have 2 values, it's easier for me to understand where to go with the next one. And the next value I'm going to use, I'm going to switch to a different brush. So now I'm going to use this brush. It's a number 10 rosemary, and I'm going to do my darkest value, which will set up a lot of what I need here. So I'm going to try to find an average value and an average color and an average temperature of color that represents my shape. And in this case, it'll be the foreground, and it'll be the trees, the barn, the road, and everything. I'm not going to separate out those objects. I'm going to make those all one shape because it's all in shadow in this case. So I want to mix up a color that kind of sort of represents that. You know, I don't want it to be too dark. I don't want it to be too light. I want it to be an average. And when I do that, I'm still going to use some mineral spirits to thin it down a little bit. Simply because I want to go from thin to thick while I'm painting. And I want to keep the temperature warm so that I understand it's in the foreground and that it comes forward. Because warm temperatures come forward and cool temperatures recede. So if this isn't correct when I start, this is the time to change it. A little too much pigment there. And what I'm doing is scumbling. I'm scumbling in my shape. And the reason I scumble is I'm trying to keep that to a thin coat of paint that I can manipulate. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be well designed because I can change it at any time. A lot of times when I'm teaching workshops, people try to match the color of the barn, the color of the road, and they forget about the value. This is what makes it simple. You know, you nail down the value, and then you add the color within the value range. And I'll explain the value range as I go. But the value range is what this big shape is that I'm putting in. It's the average value. It may be a smidge too dark, it may be a smidge too light, but it's an average. And that's all I'm really after. For instance, that's a little heavy pigment, so it looks a little darker. The reason it looks darker is because more pigment covers up the white of the canvas. So it's up to you, the artist, you know, to set these values. It's not a, you know, the values are so important, but they're important in relationship to each other. And right now I see that I'm probably a little too high on some of this as far as height. So I'm going to knock some of this out, pull it back in. I want this down just a little bit more. And sometimes when this happens, you can use that extra paint that's out there to manipulate the other shapes. So let's see if I can do that. So here is now so this was value 1, this is value 2, this is value 3. And it doesn't have to be 100% dead on, it just needs to be in relationship to each other. Now, again, my last value is the water, which is lighter than the hillside back here, but darker than what's going on in the sky. So my point would be to make that not as white, but lighter than everything else in the sky. So that kind of gives me the basic concept of my composition. And again, I may go back and I may pull some stuff out, I may lower some things, I may make some changes as I go, but it gives me my sky, my middle ground, which is the background hill and the water, and it gives me my foreground. So I know that if I paint my values and I stay within this value range, that everything will work out. But if I try to get too light, Like if I try to put a value like this here, it's going to read wrong. Of course, helping with temperatures will make this recede, but it's more important to get the values correct. And once you learn how to handle value this way, it makes it so simple you almost don't even need to go through this whole process. But it gives you a good education, and you end up with muscle memory of how to handle values the more you do this. So it is a great way to learn about shapes. Now that I have my block end accomplished, it's time to put the pieces together to this puzzle. And so let's get started with that. So the next step I usually will go to will be to define some of the objects that I have. And the objects, when I say objects, I don't mean these big shapes so much. I mean the actual objects like the barn, the road, the signs. You know, I may say the signs till a later part, but the bigger objects or the next size down. For me, it gives me a roadmap for me where I can put these value ranges. So what I do is I'll grab something along the lines like alizarin or burnt sienna, whatever I use. I want it to not be so thick that it creates an issue for mixing on the canvas, which I do little of, but it does happen, and I don't want it to be an issue. But I'll thin this down again, and I'll indicate, and I'll use my reference over here to where everything fits. It indicates, for instance, like the top of this barn, I'm going to draw where that top of that barn is. And I want to loosely put in where everything goes. So I may, again, have to make some adjustments on my drawing, but it's just an indicator of shapes. Once I know where that is, I can say, okay, that's too fat, that's too short, things like that. So I may want to, in this case, raise that barn up a little bit. So I'm going to raise this up. I want a little more height to the barn. And I may make some adjustments to my painting versus the actual reference. I like to change things up as I go. I'm not trying to mimic exactly what I see outside anyhow. So, and the reason I try not to mimic what I see outside, I want to control the environment that I'm creating in. So if I see that the barn needs to be moved over, I can easily move it over. If I see that this needs to be defined a certain way, I can do that. But it gives me opportunities to make creative choices. So once I realize where my main subject is, which is the barn, then I can put in my secondary main subject, which is the road. And I know in my reference the road comes all the way over here. This was a scene from Finger Lakes, New York in Canandaigua, and I happened across this scene while doing a plein air competition, and it was just a no-brainer to pull off side of the road and risk my life as people whizzed by me to get this. But it gave me some great opportunity for some solid painting, which hopefully I will continue doing as we go here. So I know that the bulk of my composition is kind of a Z shape. There is some light in that background that goes like this. I'm really not too interested in working with that just yet. I'm more interested in defining some of this. Now, I don't want to get too sketchy with some of these trees. I want to leave that kind of open to interpretation as I go. But I do need to indicate size and some sort of shape. So to me, I've got the bulk of what I need here. I know that there's a window there. I know there's some loose missing boards. I know there's a tree, back in here. I can put that tree over here. I can do whatever. I can make more than one tree trunk come out. So at this point, the composition's set. So I can now do the middle ground, and I can indicate the horizon line on that lake and the top of the hillside. So that gives me my composition right there, this being the focal point. At this point, what I like to do is start putting in my darkest darks. And the reason for that is oil painting is obviously a dark to light scenario, and it's easier to put darks in thinner. And I go thinner to thicker as I paint. I also want to point out that when I started scumbling in, I took my brush and I pushed hard, and I point my brush. You'll see when I finish, my brush is almost parallel to the canvas, and I'm laying paint on paint, not trying to push onto the canvas. So as I'm working, you can pay attention to some of that. So the big key for me right now is separating out shapes with values and temperatures within the range. So this is a certain range of value that's separate from that. So no matter what I put up there, I got to keep it dark enough, no matter how light the shape is, than this right here. I got to keep it warm enough so it comes forward instead of recedes. So I'm going to actually put, this tree is my darkest shape in here. So I'm going to go ahead and start working on that. I use alizarin and viridian to make dark a lot, and I find that it fits my palette well. Palette meaning the color choices I typically make, and I will scumble them in again. I'm not going to worry about the road sign at this point. Just want to get some sort of dark in. And as I go towards the top, I want to cool that dark a little bit. And again, I want to scumble some of this. So I'm going to use more ultramarine blue as I go up and more alizarin as I go down. And I'm not too worried about color choices as I am value and temperature at this point. I'll go ahead and put some more blue up in here so I have something to bounce other colors out of. All right, so there's that shape, and then there's another one right here, and I can again make creative choices. I can either make that a cooler or a warmer note. I'm still going to stay with somewhere in between, but I do need to nail that down. So I think that's a little too dark. And I try not to use white at this point, but sometimes you need to vary the value, and you can pick a lighter color or a lighter value of color and to add to that to make that decision happen. But sometimes white works because it grays and cools. So when I get closer to the barn, that barn's got some red in it, so I want to make sure I have some red in my shadow to help make that transition out of the shadow into the light. That's something I just naturally do, and everybody has their way of doing things. This is one of the ways I do it. I think of color when I'm painting as a prism, meaning like a rainbow, the way the colors touch each other. You can go from a red to an orange to a yellow, for instance. In this case, I'm going from a red to a yellowish red or a lighter red, but it's still a prism, and so you could say it's going from red to an orange. And I can put a few more darks in here to help set this up. So as you can see, I'm quickly getting a painting that doesn't need a lot of drawing because my shapes are in the right place, and which is the key to all this. This is what's simplifying everything, using those big value shapes. So I pick up a little bit of this warmth over here because I want to warm this up as I go into the barn. And I don't worry too much about edges at this point because I can define them, and I want to be able to define them as I go. So that gives me pretty much my darkest darks. You know, I can indicate a few things, but I don't have to get too concerned. One of the things I need to do, though, is define this dark here next as part of these darks. So even though this is all in shadow, this is catching more ambient light on this side, so this is darker. So I'm going to add a little white in there to knock it down, to gray it. And my red is more of an orange, so I'm adding a blue to it to gray it as well. See how close I am to what I want. So that's close enough for the moment. And again, you can see I'm not really paying attention to the lines. They're just guidelines where my shapes go. So now that I have that kind of indicated, I can start making transitions elsewhere. So get this done on this side. And when I'm looking at my canvas, I'm always comparing. You know, am I still within the value range? Well, so far I'm just dealing with darks, so yeah, it's easy to stay in this value range. But when I start adding lighter colors and white, you know, obviously I'm making the values a lighter color, so it changes the interaction. So I got to be real careful at this point, not to lose my big shape value system. That may need to go a little lighter. A little grayer. And again, I'm just trying to nail down everything within the value shape. So, except for a few places in the light, like here, there's a dark shape. That pretty much covers my darkest darks. So let me get some of these others indicated real quick. And once again, I'm not really worried about how exact I am. I just need to have good, interesting shapes. Once I nail down the shapes and they're interesting, I can make whatever adjustment I need to make them correct. But I want to get close at least. All right, I'm going to darken this just a little bit. And I want to put that overhang shadow in to help me understand where my shapes are. And I can, again, come in and address anything over again. As long as I'm in the correct value, it makes it easy to make adjustments. All right, I'm going to move to the front of this barn. And I'm going to throw some color in. that is hopefully in the correct value, lighter. Not close yet. And the nice thing about if you mix too much is that paint is very usable elsewhere. So you don't have to worry about mixing too much. I prefer, as a painter, to mix too much and have to throw away something, but I tend to try to use it so that I don't have to throw it away. And again, I will make adjustments to this. So at this point, I fairly have what I need for the barn. I mean, again, I am going to make all kinds of adjustments to this as I go. They'll be lighter, darker, warmer, cooler, according to my needs once I nail down a few things. I also, need to, make small value adjustments within these shapes so that it reads correctly. But at this point, I can move on to either the roof or some of the greenery. And so I think I'm going to do the green, since the roof is my lightest value, or one of my lightest values in the scene, the roof and the road. I'll save those for the last part of that. So what I need to do now is figure out the value and the color and the temperature of the leaves of the tree, like in here. This is my darker tree, so I want to try to figure this one out. And once I figure it out, again, I can be off and running with my color choices. Not bad. Warm it up just a smidge. And also darken it just a smidge. There we go. So I'm going to scumble in. And again, I'm not using medium as much. I'm still scumbling, still leaving some thin areas of paint so that I have an easy way to manipulate. The problem with putting too much paint on too fast is it ends up controlling your painting instead of you controlling it. It's harder to manipulate the paint. Yeah. Not that I've never done that. I've done it more than once. Sometimes it works out. It just depends. So as I go down, I want to, again, not lose my darks in some of that. I want to try to keep it warm. And I need to lose an edge there, so now's a good time to kind of mess with that. I can bring this same color over into here, but I want to warm it up just a little bit more. So when I mix my greens, I mix a variety of greens based off of temperatures, values, and so my yellow sometimes, not only will it pump up my green, it'll also give me a lighter value, which I hopefully, it may not be a big jump, but hopefully it'll be a big enough jump. And if I need to, I can use reds. And bird sienna, by the way, in my mind is a red, so I'm not opposed to using that. And when I use that thin of paint, I obviously have to come back in and make some adjustments here and there, but I usually don't have to do too much. So I'm going to start working on some of these other areas. And I want this to remain warm and dark. So I'm going to go to my ultramarine and my burnt sienna to darken that. But I want to lay down some color that I can manipulate, meaning more pigment in the right value range. So I'm going to add a little more blue to make an adjustment for temperature at the top. The thing about aerial perspective is, warm comes forward, cool recedes. What people forget to think about is trees are at the base closer to us, and it goes up into the sky, it goes away from us, so it gets cooler. Also, the light comes around the tree, and so the infiltration of the atmosphere will cool off the tree as it goes up as well. And I'm not opposed to some purer color being slapped in here and there. And redefine some of my darks. Again, at this point, I'm still kind of scumbling. I'm laying in, but I'm still making some adjustments. When I'm outside painting, I see thousands and millions even of values and colors, and we have to make decisions, to simplify it. And one of the ways I do that is I will squint down, as you've heard. Everybody talks about the squint. It is really, really important. And it gives you value instead of color. So my attitude is you squint for value, open your eyes for color. And what a lot of people don't realize is your eyes are like apertures. When you look at the light, like the studio lights, when I look at that light, the aperture of my eye, the iris, closes up to make adjustments so it doesn't hurt my eyes, and I can see into the light. When I look into the shadow, my aperture or my iris opens up. That way I can see into the dark. So when you look at your scene with open eyes the whole time, you're not seeing true value, you're seeing true color. And so people forget to squint at certain times for that purpose. So hopefully, when you're out there, you put that into practice. Again, I'm trying to darken my darks back up with a little more pigment. I just need a little more on there so I can manipulate it. So I can scumble it in, massage it in, if you will, to certain areas. Okay. So again, I am trying to unify my shapes and my color harmonies, and I see that it's time to go to some lighter values. So I'm going to go to my greens again in my lights. I want to pump them up just a little bit. So I want to cool that off just a little. So I'm going to add a little, can't remember, the cerulean blue. Add a little cerulean blue to that, and so that it kind of will match my background value just a little. So as I recede, that makes a lot more sense. Okay, I want to cool off the top of that tree. Like I said, it is going away from me. So I will put in a cooler color, hopefully within the same type of value range. Again, I'm dipping into my white and my blue to that. The white grays and cools, and the blue obviously cools, but it's darker, so it's going to darken it back up. And you may not be able to see it at the moment, but it will definitely show up as I start to mess with my colors and values. All right, so now I'm going to do the ground and the road. And I'm thinking I'm going to move this road over just a bit. So I'll pick up my brush that I was playing with earlier. Thin that down, move this out just a little bit so that it makes a little bit more sense. Okay. So now I'm doing the ground. Well, the ground catches a lot of light compared to these uprights. So it's going to be a different value, but it still needs to be darker than anything back here. So let me scrape up some of this so that I can put it aside. I'll use it as I go. I am a big fan of Edgar Payne, and in his book he talks about the soup method, and which is a whole nother video. But he also refers to what I'm scraping up as mud, which is not soup, but it kind of sort of does the same thing. It's a harmonizing mixture of everything you used in the painting, which you can use anywhere in this painting and it will work because it's very harmonized. It's all the colors you're using anyhow. So I got that set aside. I can mix it together and I can see, especially if I hold this up in my palette knife, that it is a very average, and if I put it here, it's too dark. So I know I got to go lighter. It's just one of the tricks I've learned. So I'm going to try to create a value that is warm. It's going to be darker than that, which needs to be darker. And I see when I put it to the palette, I see that it's immensely lighter. So what I can do is I can pick a little bit of that up, make an adjustment, and I am closer to doing what I need to do at this point. Let me give it more of a green tint. So I'm going to scumble in, which I will manipulate even more, my ground. And it is a value. As you can see, it's harmonious. It's in the same value range. And so it's working. But as I play with that, I'm going to create other values and other temperatures that hopefully will make some value gradations and undulations that would be interesting to the viewer. For instance, if I just make somewhat of an orange, which is more high chroma, and I put it up there, it's going to work as long as I'm applying it into that range. If I put it up there by itself, it would be too much. And I'm getting a very nice warm foreground. So I am going to run with that. Now I want to, again, make some adjustments. And for the most part, when I make these adjustments, you can see if this is my average value range. This is pretty dark for up here, and also pretty warm. So I will test my values if I think I'm getting out of line with it. Test meaning what I just did. And adding a little bit of red in there helps unify with the barn as well. So my next step, I think I'll work on the road. And the road is like, okay, what color is a road? Everybody knows it as a gray, but what kind of gray is it? Is it a red gray, a blue gray, or a yellow gray? Meaning picking from the primaries. I don't know that it's important that you match the color of the road. I think it's more important you match the value, and it harmonizes in your color scheme. So I'm going to push more of a lavender that's maybe a little heavy in the red type of gray. That I have green in my brush so that I know that it's going to be harmonious, just like my mud. And again, I can test it and see it's the same value as the other color I had put up earlier about the grass. So I'm in the right range. It's amazing how blue that looks and how green it looks here, but how blue that looks on the canvas. All right. So now, the only thing left to do would be to finish this big foreground shape would be the barn. And so I'm going to clean my same brush, just clean it up a little bit. I don't mind it being dirty because it'll help me mix that color. And I'm going to pick up a little Viridian because it's kind of a dirty green shingle. And I think Viridian can be easily a very gray-green. And one of the things that I got to remember is to stay within my value range, because if I put this up here, it's obviously fitting back there. I need to go darker. And a lot of people, when they're looking at the scene, would see that as a very bright green, which it is not. So I'm going to try to make sure it fits in the value range. I'm close. Definitely going to be lighter than the road, so it is real close. I'm going to try this. It needs to go greener. All right, so I'm going to add a little more yellow to this, trying to pump it up just a little bit. Drop the blue in. How dark am I? Okay, now I'm back to being too dark. So I'm testing again just to see. All right, now I think I'm close. Now I can make this color bluer, cooler, warmer, greener, whatever I want once I've got it in here. And again, it's like my big value masses. I just need to be really close, because I'm not going to leave that just like it is. I'll go in and manipulate it. And some of my edges I'm going to get rid of, loosen up, tighten up, whatever. So I just need to be close. All right. So when I'm painting, I may end up using some of this green in other places, but you can see it's too light, so I will have to darken it. But that pretty much gives me a very rough definition of my foreground and all the value shapes with all the color shifts and temperature shifts. So the next step would be to go to my middle ground. And the reason I'm going to my middle ground, or the hillside, versus the sky or anything else, is because it's my next darkest big shape. And again, oil painting is dark to light. One of the things that I see people do that is a pet peeve of mine is they'll paint, and some people pull it off very well, but when I'm dealing with workshop students, I demand they not do this, but they'll paint the sky in and then paint the tree back over it. And then they get these very gray, chalky trees at the top, and they can't understand why. Well, it's because you're not painting the shapes, you're painting the objects. And once you put a dark over or into a light, it also grays and makes it not what you're really truly after. So let me clean this up so I get a nice clean shift in values and colors and temperatures here. I'm going to stick with the same brush. It's working for me. I've had a lot of people ask me, are you still using the same brush for that whole painting? I say yes. I think all of us as professional artists can use one brush and create a painting. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to do that all the time. So I do have a variety of brushes, and you will see me pick up a few as I go along. But for this big block-in scenario, I'm going to stick with this at the moment. So one of the choices I have to make is what color, what value, and what temperature I'm putting here. I know this is my value system, so I know this is a blue-green as well. I'm going to go a little bluer. I'm going to go a little lighter. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of both of my blues and a little bit of Viridian. In order for me to make this work, I am going to I'll go with the amethyst. As you see, it gives me a nice color, but I want something I can paint into. And for instance, up in here, that is closer to what I think it should be when it transitions back, recedes, and into the sky. So I can indicate a little bit of this in here, just as a kind of a road map. But I'm going to switch this color at this point. What I need is more of a green-gray. And one of the first things that happens as color recedes is it takes on the atmosphere, and the first color that disappears is yellow. And when you're painting, that doesn't mean you got to get rid of yellow. You just need to understand how to cool that yellow off. And in this case, I'm looking at a bunch of different value shapes that are kind of green. Well, green has yellow in it. So I want to go with my cooler greens at times, but I'm also going to want to warm them up as well. This is getting close. I really don't want to draw in all the greens just yet. I just want to get an indication of what's here. So it's like the scumble in I did originally. I'm going to scumble in a color, value, and a temperature. and hopefully it recedes from my other shape. And I want to use a little thinner amount of paint still, so I don't get messed up with trying to recreate the wheel having too much paint on. All right, so that gives me my value shape. Temperature-wise, it's receding. It could be a little better, but it's easy enough to work with at this point. So I can make adjustments as I go. So I'm going to do my darker darks in there, and I see them as more of a reddish blue into my shadows. So the easiest choice for me would be to use something like alizarin, but I'm going to make a jump to my CAD so I can make a dirtier violet. Pick up a little bit of my Viridian. I don't want to get too dark. At this point, I think it may be just a smidge too dark. Okay. So what I'm after is trying to show where the shadows of that hillside are interplaying. I need to get my darkest darks in, for instance, just like I would in the other shapes. But if I were to put that same color here, it's going to stand out because it's way too cool. So it needs to fit the environment and the value shape that it's in. So at this point, this will be my darkest darks in that middle ground. And I will definitely be making adjustments to all these. It's almost too dark. So when I put my lights in, it'll correct it. So I'm going to try to recede even more. So I'll use a cleaner note, a cleaner color note. So add white and ultramarine. Hopefully it'll still do the same job as the darks I put down and read correctly. Believe it or not, that's lighter. Cool thing about this lake is it's glacier formed, and so all these lakes, they call them Finger Lakes for a reason. The glaciers came down and gouged into the ground these deep ravines, which became lakes. And this is not the deepest one, but it is very deep. And these hillsides just come straight up and out of the lake, and there are farms and stuff along these hills, but it's a beautiful, beautiful country. But there's a huge separation of distance here. All right, so that's my darker darks. So I'm going to go and make my lighter version of what's going on in there. Again, I want to keep it green. So this is in shadow more, a little grayer. I just need to put some paint down to indicate what's happening. come back in to manipulate at a later time. All right, so let's go a little bit lighter. I'll lighten some of this up as I go, but right at the moment, I'm going to run with this. And I also know that there's some warms and cools in here, which I've not addressed too much at this point. But I need to get this canvas covered before I start making too many adjustments in too many areas. All right, let's see what we got. Yeah, it's closer. So I will push and pull, as I call it, these little subtle scenarios in here, meaning I'll go light, dark, warmer, cooler. Right at the moment, I'm getting pretty much what I need to, same as I did down here, to get a rough rendering of what I'm looking at. So I want to add a smidge of red. Now the color, a streak of light that goes across here, you know, I have to be real careful with that as not to get too high chroma, too bright, if you will. The brightness is important, but I don't want to go too fast. All right, so this will be sufficient for the moment, just to indicate where everything goes. The reason I don't want to get too fast is, you know, you make too big of a commitment too early on, then you have a hard time making adjustments. You could easily get grayed down colors. So we'll call that sufficient for now, which is not the end result or the finished part of the painting. So now my next step is to indicate either the water or the sky. There's a million ways to finish a painting and a million ways to start, but for especially the beginner to intermediate artists, we struggle sometimes with understanding, okay, how do I pull all this together into a painting? I started painting when I was a young man. Of course, I didn't know what I was doing, didn't have any training, but I've been doing art my whole life. like most artists, I did well in high school and got a lot of attention for it. And it grew into basically an obsession from there. I've been teaching for some time, and when I deal with students, they always struggle with the start. And no matter what I taught them, they would seem to not understand, the basic concept of, how important those big shapes are. The use of the big shapes really does get rid of all the information that is in front of you when you're outside painting. For instance, leaves, barns, limbs, all that is not the big shape. Those are objects. And this is about the big shapes and the composition and values. You're going to learn how important the block-in is and how it sets up your composition and your value systems, how it will affect the end result of a painting. There's always something to paint. And if shapes and design and abstract patterns and things like that, if you add that to your arsenal, you never have a moment where you go, what can I paint? I hope this video enhances your skills simply, if nothing else, by giving you some confidence in knowing how to simplify the landscape. This gives you a roadmap in how to do that.
Well, that was Chuck Marshall, Simplifying for Success, Landscapes in Oil, and you can learn more about that at lilyartvideo.com. Now let's get right to the interview with Chuck.
I started painting when I was a young man. Of course, I didn't know what I was doing, didn't have any training, but I've been doing art my whole life. And I started out, understanding that I was going to be an artist. And, I like most artists, I did well in high school and got a lot of attention for it. And it grew into basically an obsession from there. But I've been painting, like I said, my whole life, but as a professional, I have to say I started painting back in the late 80s as a professional. I've been teaching for some time, and when I deal with students, they always struggle with the start, and no matter what I taught them, they would seem to not understand, the basic concept of, how important those big shapes are. And so I started training myself to understand how to teach that. And I finally got to the point where somebody said, hey, you ever use markers? And so I got these 4 values in markers, and I do sketches to start with in very tonal, not linear, meaning line versus big shapes. They're more tonal. So the markers made it easier for me to separate out because I had just 4 values. And I could make adjustments and make 5 or 6 values if I needed to, but it made me think, okay, if a student can get this, they would be one leg up on the start, and they would be able to understand better how to get a good painting. Because the painting isn't about objects, it's about what we do with shapes within the confines of the canvas. Teaching is rewarding. I find that when I see a student get the concepts and put it in practice and are successful, there's some pride in that for me. I've had students who have entered art shows that have been with me for years and have won awards when I didn't. A lot of people would go, how does that make you feel? It makes me feel proud. It's like raising a child, if you will. And I don't mean it literally. It's just, you have some association with their success. Well, when I first started painting, the subject was about objects. And now it's transformed to other things as well. More so, it's about design. It's about shapes. Sometimes it's texture. Sometimes it's light. It's a variety of things, but it's grown into and away from objects. I do studio work. I do plein air work, and the studio work is totally different than my plein air work. So the plein air is plein air impressionism. And the studio, I would just say impressionism / realism. I can be real tight sometimes, and I can be real loose sometimes. It depends on my mood, actually, and what I'm looking at. I prefer to be outside painting in plein air versus a studio. I think it's easier to get the truth of what you're looking at. What I'm referring to is the color temperatures, the values, the feel of the moment. I've always loved landscapes. Since I was a kid, I was born and raised in Wilmington, Ohio, and there's 7 of us kids, and we're born in a little town outside of Wilmington, Ohio called New Antioch. And the house was originally a fur shack. And so it had 1 bathroom and 2 bedrooms that my dad built onto it. So, you know, like I have 5 sisters and 1 brother. So we're packed in there. So I love going outside. I grew up hunting and fishing and working outside all the time. And it was my passion to be outside. So it just naturally translated. I want to draw and end up painting it. So when I'm outside, I just get rejuvenated. Thumbnails are real important. Just, you know, I do a lot of plein air competitions, and, you know, we have to be efficient with our time. We have to, you know, produce good work and, you know, hopefully good enough to win awards and make sales. You know, otherwise, you know, there's no point in it. And it just translates into better art, period. So if I do a thumbnail, I'm actually looking to find and define what those big shapes are. You know, most people see it as, okay, I'm going to do a thumbnail to get my composition. Well, I do that as well, but I see it more as, you know, what are my big shapes? You know, because they also define the composition. And if I concentrate on the concept of big shapes, it always works out better. If subject is something that inspires you, then it's limited. Don't get me wrong, there's a million subjects out there. But if shapes and design and abstract you know, patterns and things like that, if you add that to your arsenal, you never have a moment where you go, what can I paint? There's always something to paint. And it's always something that's harder to do each time. The more you learn, the more you know you don't know anything. And it's just like the carrot in front of the horse. You know, you walk to the carrot, but you never get there, but you're still moving forward. And that keeps me excited. Plein air painting, I've got lots of stories. I don't know where to start. I've had a gun pulled on me out plein air painting by a cop. Thought I was messing with equipment, and you know, I was painting this field of flowers, and I knew it was going to be bulldozed, and so there's all this big equipment around, and behind me was this big pile of dirt, and so I'm down this road at the end of it, behind the big pile of dirt, and I hear this cop car siren going, and it just got closer and closer, and while I'm painting, I'm going, somebody's in trouble, and so all of a sudden it stopped, and you know, I'm pretty much ignoring it, and then I hear, hold it. And I turn around, there's a guy standing there, a cop, with a gun pulled, and he just starts laughing and puts his gun away and walks away. I've had animals knock my easel over. You know, you name it, I've had it happen. When I get done here, I've got to prepare for a show I have coming up. And it's a show dear to my heart because it's about the Wind River Range in Wyoming. Last few years I've done pack trips up into the Wind River Range and with a group of guys who are artists, and we go up there and paint and just hang out. It's great fun, but it's like, that's heaven to me. You know, I mean, I think I was born to be out west instead of a Midwest boy. I love being on a horse. I love painting out there. I love seeing the moose and the bear and everything. So one of the guys said, hey, let's do a 2-man show at the Isley Gallery in Cincinnati. And so we talked to them and got it arranged. And so I'm gearing up for that, and I can't wait for it. Other than that, I'm going to Cape Ann to paint in Gloucester and Rockport, and love that area. That's where some of the American plein air painters originally started. There's some real history there.
Well, I hope you enjoyed getting to know Chuck Marshall. That was Simplifying for Success, Landscapes in Oil. You can learn more about that at lilyartvideo.com. I'm Eric Rhodes. Thanks for watching.
There's a million ways to finish a painting and a million ways to start, but for especially the beginner to intermediate artists, we struggle sometimes with understanding, okay, how do I pull all this together into a painting? I started painting when I was a young man. Of course, I didn't know what I was doing, didn't have any training, but I've been doing art my whole life. Like most artists, I did well in high school and got a lot of attention for it. And it grew into basically an obsession from there. I've been teaching for some time, and when I deal with students, they always struggle with the start. And no matter what I taught them, they would seem to not understand, the basic concept of, how important those big shapes are. The use of the big shapes really does get rid of all the information that is in front of you when you're outside painting. For instance, leaves, barns, limbs, all that is not the big shape. Those are objects. And this is about the big shapes and the composition and values. You're going to learn how important the block-in is and how it sets up your composition and your value systems, how it will affect the end result of a painting. There's always something to paint. And if shapes and design and abstract patterns and things like that, if you add that to your arsenal, you never have a moment where you go, what can I paint? I hope this video enhances your skills simply, if nothing else, by giving you some confidence in knowing how to simplify the landscape. This gives you a roadmap on how to do that.